You guys, here we have it, the Asus Zephyrus G16, the MacBook of gaming laptops. Honestly, the MacBook Air of gaming laptops. Before I even start, I just want to say nearly every major review I've seen of this laptop has gotten a lot wrong about it. Every review that I kept seeing come out, something was just off, and it didn't align with my experiences of the same laptop, to the point where I really had to ask, am I crazy? I had to get with the community a lot on this one, and I'm glad I did, because it definitely seems like the owner of our average retail unit for this laptop will likely have a much different and likely better experience than what many other reviews have shown, and we'll get to that. So this is a video I've really took my time making, and once again has probably now topped the most data I've ever collected for a laptop review. This time reaching out to literally dozens of other G16 owners, getting other people's benchmarks, trying to nail down quirks and potential issues, debunking claims from other reviews, and there's just a lot to unpack here. So sit back, relax, and hit that subscribe button, because we're about to take a deep dive into one of the most interesting gaming laptops I've ever seen, the Zephyrus G16. So the G16 comes in a variety of configurations. In the US, you have a 4070 option with the new Core Ultra 7 CPU from Intel, a 4080 model with Core Ultra 9, and a 4090 model, also with Core Ultra 9. The configurations this year seem to vary wildly by region, with even a 4060 model being out there in some places. But the GPU options are the same old RTX 4000 series from last year, which is kind of sad to see. I really wish Nvidia would have given us at least a TI series of GPUs this year, with even just slight improvements like they did the 3000 series and the 2000. But here we are, 2 years of the same GPU. That's really no one's fault but Nvidia's, so just keep that in mind that basically any 2024 laptop will be almost no different than its 2023 counterpart. So Asus took that opportunity and worked on every other aspect of the laptop instead. This makes the 2024 G16 a massive step up from last year's. If you've been watching my channel, you'll know that I was not a big fan of what they did to the 2023 version of this laptop. Not that that one is a bad laptop, it just was basically a 2022 Zephyrus M16 renamed. Here I loved the G15, which was what the G16 was previously known as, and in 2023 I was hoping they were going to give us the G16 and it was going to be this awesome AMD-based competitor like it always was, and then they just gave us a really stock, basically M16, and called it a G16. I was pissed. The G series has usually been their AMD CPU-specific line of Zephyrus laptops, so they had a bit of an identity crisis. But they're back, and while this still isn't an AMD configuration, I'll argue the Meteor Lake chip is surprisingly similar to its AMD counterpart, and we'll talk about that. Plus, there is supposedly a configuration on the way with AMD's new Strix Point CPUs, so they really did bring back the beloved G series big time this year. And by doing that, they didn't really even bother with the M series for 2024, so my theory is that they're just saving a refresh of the M16 for a new Nvidia GPU that will likely push wattage and performance just a little further than the G series, but we'll see. So let's start with the design of this thing, because that's the star of the show here. The design is absolutely gorgeous, and I was so caught off guard. Like, I know the Zephyrus laptops are known to be thinner and lighter than the competition, but I never expected them to go this thin and light. Like, literally thinner and lighter than the current MacBook Pro 16 in a gaming laptop. Like, that is just unheard of. I mean, to put it in perspective, this laptop is less than a millimeter thicker than the 15-inch MacBook Air. And the MacBook Air is already smaller to begin with a 15-inch screen. And the G16 is smaller in all dimensions than the MacBook Pro 16, while also weighing about a half a pound less. The Razer Blade 16 in comparison is about the same length and width, but much thicker and over a pound heavier at 5.4 pounds, which with laptops, you will definitely feel that when carrying it around or in a backpack, which puts the Zephyrus G16 in a different class entirely than the Razer Blade, almost more like a slim Ultrabook in comparison. But was this a good decision? Did Asus need to go that thin and light? Well, it's definitely an interesting one, and I have a theory that Asus never actually meant for these to be Zephyrus laptops, maybe? In fact, they're sold as the G Air in China, but take that with a grain of salt, as Chinese translation for these laptops is kind of hard to go off of. What I think really happened is that Asus just saw an opportunity, since there weren't going to be any new GPUs in 2024, just more efficient CPUs. So they just ran with that. They didn't want this to be the new M16, because the M16 is supposed to be a little more powerful, so instead they finally gave the G15 its proper upgrade. And I can proudly say that this is the successor to the G15 that I always wanted to see, even though it's still Intel, but again, we'll talk about that later. So we we have a full CNC aluminum chassis here, which I never thought I'd see Asus do, but I'm extremely thankful they did. Not that I ever had a problem with magnesium alloy. Those are also very sturdy and premium feeling laptops, but I will say there is something that just feels special about CNC aluminum. Like that cold to the touch feeling when you haven't used it for a while. For me, this makes me question why I'd even want Razer anymore. I mean, they literally did what I said no one was doing in my Razer Blade review. Now you can get that MacBook-like laptop in an even thinner and lighter chassis than Razer, and saving potentially $1,000 or more in the process. Now, one thing I will say is that the paint coating they use is still very different from Razer. While the dark gray isn't perfectly fingerprint proof, it's not nearly as much of a fingerprint magnet as Razer's, but I think the trade-off with this coating is that it doesn't quite make it feel as metal. It's hard to describe, like you can really feel the metal of the chassis on the Razer Blade, but the G16 seems to have a thicker coating, so it's harder to really know that it's aluminum just by looking at it, and kind of to the touch as well. Again, that's a pro and a con in itself. Like a thicker coating, or whatever texture coating this is much harder to scratch and chip than the Blades. The Razer Blade's coating is almost impossible not to chip at some point and see a shiny aluminum dot staring at you in its place and ruining your day. So I'm going to say this coating is a net positive, and I'm thankful it's not rubberized either like some other laptops out there. It's available in white as well, which I tried on the G14, and I gotta say, I think I prefer that finish. It's like a really light silver. You can't really see fingerprints at all, and the silvery color makes it pop even more that, like, hey, this is a metal laptop, check it out. Also, we gotta talk about the slash. That has been a big point of conversation for this thing, and yeah, to be honest, I'm cool with it. I think in person it looks nice and it gives it some character. I think in future iterations it could be a little more subtle, like maybe closer in color to the laptop chassis, and maybe find a way for the LEDs to like shine through from underneath the lid or something. That'd be cool. But yeah, I mean, you can change it to display a bunch of different patterns, and I dig that it isn't as gamery looking as Anime Matrix, although I still enjoy that one as well. Also, some people say the hinge is wobbly, and that was something pointed out by some reviews too, but I'm genuinely confused there because I don't find it wobbly at all on the G16 or G14. Like this right here is very standard laptop hinge wobble, you guys. This is nothing out of the ordinary. That was another thing I confirmed with people I chatted with, and overall everyone agreed that the hinge is not like noticeably wobbly at all. It feels just fine. So it doesn't shake when you're typing. It's a good hinge. I mean, sure, they probably could have made it a little tighter, I guess, but this is pretty standard. I mean, it feels very much like every other gaming laptop hinge I've used. Also, I bought this and the new G14 with my own money, as well as every laptop I review, so there is nothing here that I was told to say or mention. This is just my straight up experience from daily driving and benchmarking this laptop for over 2 months. The keyboard is insanely good. Just like other Asus ROG laptops that I've used, I have no issues with it at all. And because it's centered without a numpad, you get these awesome up-firing speakers on the side, and I just prefer a typing experience in the center of the laptop, especially if I'm actually using it in my lap. They increased the size of the keycaps this year, which I feel like it helped me make less mistakes while typing, but that could just be me. Looks really clean though. I think my only complaint now would be the font. Asus, I think it's finally time we move past the ROG font on the Zephyrus laptops. And to me, that's a really good thing if the biggest complaint I can personally find for a laptop's design is something as minuscule as the font of the keys. Oh, and per key RGB would be really nice here instead of just one zone, but maybe one day. Speaking of the lighting, make sure you turn off Windows dynamic lighting if you get this laptop because it tries to control the keyboard lighting through Windows instead of Armoury Crate, and that just doesn't work. Now, same with the trackpad, nice and centered and enormous, and it's glass, so super smooth. I cannot stress how nice it is to have a glass trackpad over a plastic one like on the Legion Pro 7i, and I'm still begging for Lenovo to change that. For most people, this will be one of the best trackpads you've ever used, but I'm not gonna lie, I got kind of a defect on mine. It doesn't seem to be too common of an issue, but I'm still gonna point out that mine has a really loud click and it just sounds off. It performed just fine and nothing is technically wrong with it. Like functionality wise, it's fine, but it's just I know what this trackpad is supposed to sound like, and this was not it. Especially when I had the G14s right there to compare it to. So here's a sound sample. Alright, so the display. So for a lot of people, this display is going to be the holy grail of gaming laptop displays, or just maybe laptop displays in general right now. We've got a very high refresh rate at 240 Hertz. We've got QHD. We've got 400 nits of brightness. We've got Dolby Vision. We have glossy. We have a flush glass bezel. Oh yeah, and it's OLED with Gsync. You couldn't say that before. Like that simply did not exist before this year. So It is sad that it took this long, but this is the first laptop to have G-Sync on an OLED display. Asus has a write-up on their site about how complicated this apparently was and their partnership with Samsung to push for a display like this, but we have it, and boy am I glad we do. That means smooth, high refresh, tear-free gaming on an OLED laptop for once, and actually being able to use features like Advanced Optimus as well. The Razer Blade 16 has the same panel, and the only difference is the coating they use. The Blade 16 is even glossier, so it's basically like a mirror with no reflection handling. Some people might prefer that, but I really like what Asus did here. I thought it was a full glossy panel as well until I started using it and noticed it actually has a really effective anti-reflection coating on it. And to me, that's kind of the best of both worlds. As someone who prefers glossy panels, I think I'd take this one personally. The only downside I gotta say is that it does have this tint to it when light hits it and the display is off, but I only noticed it at certain angles really. You might be thinking this sounds like a QD OLED panel with that tint, but no, it's not QD OLED, just part of the anti-reflective coating, and not really something I noticed in normal use, to be honest. Just when I had the laptop off and sitting out did I really see this. One thing I found no reviews mention is that this OLED panel has an S-stripe subpixel pattern. As some of you may know, many OLED subpixel patterns can cause text fringing or just blurry text in general, but thankfully S-stripe is one of the best for handling text, and apparently it's better at reducing burn-in as well. So yeah, and I noticed that myself. I have a QD OLED monitor, and I found the text to be much clearer and sharper on the G16 than it was on my monitor. So it's a 600p QHD display. I still think this is the sweet spot for laptop displays at 16 inches, as any resolution above that is really hard to notice, except maybe in text and some small icons, and those higher resolutions will absolutely tank your FPS, like what we're seeing with these 2000p displays, or 3.2K, whatever they call it, in many Lenovo laptops, and even the new G14 with its 1800p display takes a hit to FPS because of that. And of course, reducing those to 1600p will unfortunately not be as sharp as a native 1600p panel. So to me, that's kind of a lose-lose situation for now, at least in 2024. I personally don't like sacrificing that much of my FPS for an almost imperceivable increase in sharpness in games. Maybe when we get RTX 5090s or 6090s, then we can enjoy that luxury more, but for now, 1600p is perfect. So now you're probably thinking, but what about mini LED? Like, how does this compare? And I'll tell you how, because I have one right here. The G14 here can hit 700 nits of brightness, while the G16 hits about 420 nits at the most, which isn't dim by any means. Like, there's 300 nit panels like on the Alienware X16, and I would consider those kind of dim in comparison. But mini LED is just on another level of brightness with other laptops like the 2023 Zephyrus M16 or the Blade 16's mini LED panels, which can hit over 1,000 nits of brightness. And yes, that is blindingly bright in comparison. You can almost light up a whole room with just your laptop. And I'm not gonna lie to you, after being used to those, I felt myself wishing I could press the brightness up option on my keyboard just one more time on the G16. So if you're not used to mini LED displays, then this will absolutely be bright enough for you. But if you work in heavy sunlight a lot, or you just love to burn your eyes out with HDR 1000, then yeah, you will miss that here. But does it being OLED make up for that? I think in terms of having instant response times and inky blacks with absolutely zero blooming, then for some people, sure. But just don't forget that all OLEDs come with a risk of burn-in, and there will always be a debate online over how serious this issue is. My thing is, if you plan to keep the laptop for more than 3 years and you do nothing to prevent burn-in, then you shouldn't be surprised to start seeing some signs of burn-in around that 3-year mark. And it might even happen if you were taking precautions too. But then you have other people out there who have had their OLED displays for 5 years with no issues. So it really is just one of those things that varies a lot, but it's never a 0% risk. Thankfully, Asus already has some burn-in prevention locked in from the start, including having screensaver enabled by default, pixel refresh, and some other options you can find in Armory Crate. Also, I need to point out the texture these panels produce on certain background colors. This is really only noticeable on dark grayish backgrounds, but I've pulled other users, and this is not a defect, but just a quirk that these panels have, and it exists both on the G16 and Blade 16 since they use the same panel. There's this sort of graininess, almost like sandpaper, in these dark gray areas. It's most noticeable when you're on Google or Reddit in dark mode. Like, watch as the camera goes back and forth between like the mini LED G14, which is just a flat color here, and then you see this sort of textured look that the G16 has in comparison on that same color. Now, like I said, this is only noticeable ever on some flat gray backgrounds. So if I'm watching movies or playing games, I don't notice it at all. Just something I thought I'd point out, and yet another thing I didn't see any other reviewers catch, and we've still got more coming there. So I know that was a lot to talk about for the display, but it really is a critical piece to this puzzle. If you're an OLED fan and you just love glossy panels with inky blacks and instant response times, and you hate even the thought of noticing blooming, then look no further, because this is for you. Just one of the best displays out there overall, and undoubtedly the best OLED laptop display for gaming. So for ports, you have their new like charging port thing on the left-hand side. I guess it's okay. I mean, I don't really have an issue with it, but I do kind of like the barrel charger and how you could flip the orientation around. This one is like straight in, it's not angled anymore. So I don't know. I don't really know how to feel about it. I do think just the old barrel charger was just a better option. I guess this one maybe looks nicer, but it's to me not quite as convenient. You have HDMI 2.1 for 4K 120 Hz output. You have a Thunderbolt USB-C port with display out. This one's connected to the integrated graphics, so this is going to be your Optimus output. So no G-Sync will be able to come from this port. And then you have your USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port. Then on the right side, you have another USB-C port. This one isn't Thunderbolt. This one's connected directly to the Nvidia graphics. So if you have a G-Sync monitor, you want to use this port. You have another USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port, and then a full-size SD card reader, which I don't know if they've ever had a full-size SD card reader on a Zephyrus laptop before. So that is pretty cool. Actually really do like that. I know a lot of people that is like a deal breaker for some reason to have a full size over a mini, but I use mini SD cards for everything and just put them in the little SD card adapter. To me, that's just as good, but still a great thing to see. I like that they did that. Giving people options is nice. Overall, I think it's a great port selection. It was always weird to me how the G14 had both USB-A ports on the right. Here, they're one on the left, one on the right. You have no side vents here compared to other Zephyrus laptops, which moves the ports further up, and I really do appreciate that. The charger itself is 240 watts, pretty compact. You know, we're all waiting for a new revolution in charging bricks, and they're getting smaller. I feel like every year with GAN chargers and stuff like that, it's getting better. This is pretty small in comparison to many other gaming laptops out there, and so I don't really have an issue with it. Just a little bit bigger than the G14's 180 watt charger. What I did find funny was the cable links were different for some reason on both. Like the cable to the wall was longer on the G16, while the cable from the brick to the laptop was longer on the G14. I don't really know why that was, if that was like an actual strategic decision on their part, but just something I thought was funny. I do appreciate the thin, flexible cords though. That's a really niche like thing to appreciate in a laptop, but a really flexible thin cord is a lot easier to put in a backpack compared to like the Legion Pro 7i with its extremely thick behind cables. So internally, this is an interesting device, and ironically, this is where most of the criticism lies for this laptop, and most of mine as well. But I'm also amazed by what they accomplished. So looking at the back, they've first of all made it much easier to get into the laptop and to prevent stripping screws by switching to T5s all the way around. They also got rid of the anchor screw, which personally I'm going to miss that, but it seemed like too many people just thought it was a stuck screw, and it's so dumb, but it just caused a lot of confusion, so I get why they removed that. And now, instead of having to nearly use a microscope and surgically remove these middle screws, they finally gave us much easier removable grommets at the top here to remove the final two screws here. Once we're inside, the first thing that hits you is that vapor chamber. It is awesome, and I'm so glad that they included that. My complaint though is that I actually don't understand why they made a whole different inferior cooling system for the 4060 and 4070 models. Like, why even go through the trouble of making two different cooling systems for the same laptop? The lower tier models get a third fan instead of a vapor chamber, and this leads to slightly warmer temperatures and higher fan noise. So I personally think that was a mistake. It really should have been vapor chambers across the board at this price especially. The next thing you might notice is, where's the RAM? Well, they went with a completely soldered LP DDR5X RAM for this laptop. And to be perfectly honest, this might come as a shock, but I actually have no problem with that decision. Now, before you turn the video off, hear me out. LP DDR5X is extremely fast RAM and it has an extremely low rate of failure. And if it makes the laptop thinner while allowing more room for cooling, then I say sure, go for it. But, this is a big but. What I do have a big problem with, if you go this route as a company, then you need to offer different configurations of RAM to choose from for the consumer. And in some regions, they sort of do. Like some regions get a 32GB 4070 model to choose from, but guess what? Not here in the US. So you have to purchase the 4080 or 4090 model at a huge price increase just to get 32 gigabytes of RAM, or else you're stuck with 16 gigs. And to me, that's just unacceptable. Don't get me wrong, I think 16 gigabytes will be plenty for a lot of people, especially those who are choosing the lower tier option to begin with, but dear lord, the option would have just been nice. Like, that is all we want, is an option. I know people would gladly pay just $100 or maybe even $200 to upgrade the RAM to 32 gigs. Even if it is soldered, it doesn't matter. And shoot, they should have even offered a 64 gigabyte version. I mean, I know for a fact there are some creatives out there who would pay good money just to have that option for 64 gigabytes. But nope. You're stuck with what they offer. And in the US, that is only 3 options. 16 gigabytes might even prove to not be enough in the future, with games and browsers using more RAM by the day, it seems. So I'm just really confused by this decision, and I really hope we'll see some more options in 2025. On my unit, I went ahead and opened up the heatsink, which was super easy actually, with numbered screws that are all anchored. In fact, in this clip, I even forgot to unplug the battery, so I did all of this with the battery plugged in, which is not recommended. The liquid metal application was actually applied pretty well on my unit, with just a little extra along the outer edge, but that is much better than them not applying enough and seeing a giant empty spot in the middle of your CPU. I'll reiterate this in every video, but the industry really needs to move towards cryo sheets instead of factory liquid metal application. That way you guarantee an even application every time, since it's literally a sheet. Or just use PTM, which is pretty close to liquid metal in performance and basically never goes bad. They have the same PTM phase changing pad on the GPU this year as they did on the G14 from last year. So, I mean, they're already using it here. You know, it'd be nice to just see them use it on both, but it's good to see it's on the GPU. Although I noticed 2 of the VRAM chips had no thermal putty on them, so I went ahead and applied some of what I prefer, which is Upsiren U6 Pro. I just did this as a precaution just in case that wasn't intentional. Oh, also you get a 2 terabyte SSD pre-installed on this unit, and the speeds are really fast, really good. You also have a slot for an extra SSD if you wanted to add one. So battery life. I never thought I'd be saying the words Intel and battery life and good in the same sentence, unless I was saying Intel's battery life is not good. But here we are. I stand corrected. But before we get to that, I just want to point out that only 3.9% of my viewers are subscribed to my channel. That means 96% of the people watching this channel aren't subscribed. And all I'm trying to say is I would just really appreciate just hitting that subscribe button, maybe even hitting the bell so you can be notified about future uploads, because I plan to do a lot more laptop videos this year. And even aside from reviews, I plan to do more just about general news and laptops, maybe some more niche topics like Vbios swaps, upgrades, things like that. So it would definitely mean a lot to me if you subscribe, because I really want to continue putting out these thorough laptop reviews, but also work my way up to being able to do more. These Meteor Lake Core Ultra chips are weirdly named, but they are super efficient. Like, wow. Keep in mind, these are not the same chips as the Raptor Lake HX chips found in thicker laptops. Those still have pretty terrible battery life. But yeah, this CPU right here is honestly one of my favorite parts about 2024 laptops. I never thought I'd see the day where I was happy using an Intel laptop off the charger, but they finally did it. This and the new G14 are now my highest scoring laptops for battery life, with both sitting at 9.5 hours of YouTube playback. And I could comfortably be doing basic tasks and browsing with only like 7 to 9 watts of discharge, which that would equate to around 10 hours or more. And that's just in silent and eco mode at 60 Hertz. I didn't even do any like crazy optimizations that some people do out there. So I would be willing to bet that some people can probably get even 10 or 11 hours or more on this laptop. Oddly enough, the Alienware X16 with the same CPU seems to get much lower battery life than this from what I'm seeing in reviews. So I don't really know what happened there, but I'm glad it at least works well here. Plus you can disable, P and E cores, which theoretically could improve battery life even more, but your mileage may vary. Alright, so the speakers. Wow. Like every review has mentioned, these are the best. I think these are the best speakers I've ever heard on any laptop ever. Like, this caught me so off guard. I was not expecting them to be this good. It's almost like a MacBook 16, and I was beginning to think that Windows laptops would never catch up, like they just didn't care. But here we are. Like, I don't think anything else even comes close to these. And I already loved the Zephyrus speakers from years past, but this even blows those out of the water. Like, it's not even close. So to demonstrate, I wrote lyrics to a laptop speaker test song, and I had AI bring it to life because I really just wanted to highlight how punchy these things sound. So check it out, and if you really like the song, I might even record it myself, but here you go.
Laptop speakers sound good. Do they sound the way that they should? Which one do you think sounds best? laptop speaker test. Laptop speakers, they better never hear. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
Alright, so while we're on the topic of noise, let's talk about fan noise. This is another much debated topic for the G16, and I'm going to go ahead and give you a sneak peek. It's not bad at all. I think my worst complaint would be that yes, fans do sometimes just barely kick in if you're plugged in on silent mode, which kind of goes against Asus's advertisement of 0 decibels, but the RPM is so low that you can't really hear it without putting your ear to the keyboard. And on battery, I could enjoy 0 RPM fans even when there's 20 tabs open without the chassis even getting hot, and that was just a really nice experience. And in a second, I'll talk about how you can achieve 0 fans no matter what. So when you're gaming, the turbo mode is about as loud as any other gaming laptop. I'd say it's about average, not quiet by any means, but not as loud as the M16 from last year was in turbo mode. It's about the same as the Legion Pro 7i to my ears, only slightly higher in pitch, but not enough to sound whiny or annoying by any means. Speaking of whininess, there are many reports of whiny sounding fans on the 3 fan models, which are the 4060 and 4070 configurations. And I'm hearing mixed reports. Some people have said that these still stay very quiet in silent mode or at 0 RPM, like what I experienced. But I would say, after looking at it and researching and talking to people and from people who had both, that overall the general consensus is that the 3 fan configurations are a bit higher in pitch, in fact, and about 1 to 2 decibels louder. I'm not sure if that would be enough to be a deal breaker for some people, but maybe if you're just really sensitive to high pitched noises, then sure. So here's a comparison to the 2024 G14 and the 2023 G14, which are both close to the same levels as far as fans, maybe just a bit quieter. So one thing I try to do to give a reference of what this fan noise means, because sometimes fan noise doesn't really matter as long as you're getting a lot of performance out of it. Or maybe a laptop is really quiet in comparison, but the performance sucks. So that's what this chart is here to achieve. It's the same laptops in each major row here. They're just separated by a power profile. And the light blue bar is the average fan noise you get in that mode. And the longer bars here are the TimeSpy graphics score to fan noise ratio. So this is how much graphics score you would get per decibel of fan noise. Of course, a higher performing GPU will have a bit of a bias here, but for the fan noise freaks out there, this one's for you, all right? And it's just good comparative data, because this applies also to if you're just comparing, for example, the G16 to the M16, whether that be the 4070 model or the 4080 or 4090. So it kind of applies to all of them, at least comparatively, GPU to GPU. So anyways, the G16 here at about 47 decibels, 385 points per decibel. That puts it pretty high up there with the rest of them. Definitely above the M16, which has a 56 decibel turbo mode. And it does put it just barely ahead of last year's G14, because technically it is 2 decibels quieter in its turbo mode. Even though I didn't really find it to be that much quieter, to me they're about the same level. So maybe it's just the difference in pitch. But yeah, so the G16 in balance mode is pretty much neck and neck with last year's G14 4090 at 374 points per decibel. Again, these are very similar laptops in their balance mode and in their turbo mode, and both are doing much better than the Zephyrus M16 here. But of course, you're not getting quite as much performance per decibel as the Legion and the Razer Blade 16. That's just because those are, your full wattage GPUs giving you more performance in general. And then in silent mode, that's where the G14 takes the lead, but now the G16 is pretty close behind at 416 points per decibel. It's my new second place here above the Blade 16. That's because these silent modes can just be tuned so well and perform extremely well for how little noise they can put out. So that is really awesome to see it, 37 decibels, and it's killing it. So yeah, overall, it's pretty solid. I don't have any complaints really about the fan noise. I think it's a good laptop. I think it sounds really good. Now keep in mind, some people say they don't experience the whiny third fan at all, so it really might vary quite a bit by unit. However, if you do find that third fan to be a bit whiny, G-Helper is going to be your saving grace. You can turn down the third fan independently in G-Helper in a pinch, or turn it off completely, and boom, problem fixed. And you can also do this in Armory Crate's manual mode as well. Another cool thing about the fan noise I just wanted to add here real quick is that the developer of G-Helper added a new experimental fan curve that is much more exact, and you can even go beyond what the BIOS would normally allow for the fans. This means that you can get very exact RPM at a very exact temperature compared to normal fan curves. The best part is this means you can literally have the fans completely shut off. So absolutely 0 RPM no matter what, of course at your own risk, but just a cool little thing I thought I'd point out. Alright, so software. This is the most skipped part of my videos, so I'm just going to try to make this a little shorter. Thankfully, these don't come with McAfee anymore, at least mine didn't. So basically, all you need on a laptop like this is run your Windows updates, Microsoft Store updates, and if you want, grab the latest drivers from Nvidia and Intel. Armory Crate and my Asus handle all of your laptop's tuning and critical updates. Armory Crate this year is identical to last year, so if you want a detailed walkthrough, check out one of the older videos, but basically you've got your power plans, which are Windows, which lets Windows control your tuning, Silent, which prioritizes quiet fans and low power, Performance, which really should be named Balance because it's a balance of power and fan noise, and then Turbo, which allows your GPU and CPU to dynamically run at the max wattage allowed with, of course, loud fans. Manual mode gives you tons of control over your CPU, much more than you can find in most other gaming laptop softwares. This includes your sustained power limit, the power limit you can hold for 2 minutes. You can also change your overclock for the GPU, the dynamic boost value, the max thermals that you would like the GPU to run at, which is pretty cool, and it'll dynamically adjust the performance to match that. There's one cool new feature here exclusive to 2024 Asus laptops, and that is the base TGP slider right here. So you can actually set what wattage your GPU runs at before dynamic boost. So this means you can have max fans, but you can choose to run your GPU at the lowest possible wattage if you wanted to, and prioritize your CPU instead. Or you can force it to maximize your GPU wattage by sliding it all the way to the right. This is how you access those extra 10 watts allowed to the GPU on this G16, which again, no other review is mentioned, so I just thought I would bring that up here. Some other cool features you have are just, panel power saver, which switches to 60 Hertz automatically on battery. You can disable the Windows key. One thing I highly recommend is just going into Nvidia control panel, click the desktop tab at the top and hit show dynamic display mode tray icon. This allows you to use advanced Optimus as you please and select whether you want to be in Optimus or DGPU mode on your own, which I find really convenient to just have it right there in the taskbar because I don't always trust it to do it automatically. But yeah, there's lots of other cool little features in Armory Crate if you look around. These can also be found in G-Helper, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically things like being able to switch the color gamut of your display, some power saving features, some OLED care features. So it's a really great software. Now, it wouldn't be a conversation about Armory Crate, though, if I didn't talk about G-Helper. And since I have no contractual obligations, I can straight up tell you that G-Helper is an amazing piece of software and that I highly recommend people uninstall Armory Crate and use this instead. It's just good to know what Armory Crate looks like and does so you know where the settings translate to on G-Helper. I have a whole video on it and I highly recommend checking that out. Asus, if you're watching, quit messing around and just work with Serge on making Armory Crate more like G-Helper. All right, the community would really have a much more positive light about Armory Crate if it was more snappy and easy to use like this. I know even talking about G-Helper probably just ruined any chance of Asus using this review for their marketing material, but it needs to be mentioned because it really is a game-changing piece of software. All right, so CPU performance. So this is the Intel Core 9. This is the Intel Core Ultra 9 185H. Yeah, that's a mouthful. I don't know what Intel is thinking with these naming schemes, but basically think of this as the successor to the laptop H chips from years past. So basically this is the successor to the i9-13900H from last year, only much more efficient now. This move towards efficiency was a big change for Intel, and yes, it does come slightly at a cost, but I'd argue the benefits outweigh that. So it's a 16-core chip with 6 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores, and 2 low-power efficiency cores, which are even more efficient than the E-cores, basically for offloading processes that don't need that much power. If you get the Core Ultra 7 155H model, then congratulations, it's the same CPU CPU, but just running at slightly lower clocks. The CPU will hit up to about 110 watts on the G16, but it levels off for the most part around 80 to 90 watts in a CPU only load. This is more than enough wattage because the majority of the power from the CPU occurs at 60 watts and below. The Cinebench scores you get from it are pretty nice, right in line with the i9-13900H from last year. You know, of course, much lower than the power-hungry HX Raptor Lake chips, but those are not really efficient at low wattages, and I'll show that in a second. The one downfall of this chip seems to be the single-core performance. It's not quite there and is scoring about on par with AMD or a little below it, and a little below Intel chips from last year. Unfortunately, you'll see later that kind of does affect gaming performance just a little bit, since most games love themselves some single-core. But now let's talk about where this is advantageous, and I need to explain this graph to really demonstrate how groundbreaking this is for Intel. So check this out. Each line here is a different CPU, and from left to right, this shows what wattage they're running at, and the level of performance or the Cinebench score that they get from that wattage. For a gaming laptop, you typically want one that can get the most performance using the least amount of wattage, and Intel really stepped it up here for Meteor Lake. The HX chips can obviously hit a higher peak wattage, so that's why their scores are so high, but look how low they score at low wattages. An HX chip has to run at like 50 to 60 watts before it can even start to beat an AMD Ryzen chip in performance. And in games, for example, you rarely see 50 to 60 watts consistently anyway, so this is great to know that this CPU here can run, for example, at 20 watts on this Core Ultra chip and get the same level of performance as 35 watts on the HX chip. It's actually neck and neck with the Ryzen 9 chips up until about 40 to 50 watts, where it actually starts to pass both. But yeah, this 10 to 30 watt range is really a sweet spot here. Getting that much performance at that low of wattage means less cooling needed, better performance on battery, better battery life in general. It's just a huge win for consumers. And as someone who has been pretty upset with Intel for ignoring this and only pursuing peak performance over the years, this is a huge breath of fresh air. So let's get to the next thing most reviewers get wrong about this laptop. It is not a 115 watt GPU. This is in fact a 125 watt GPU on this laptop. It even says it right here in Nvidia control panel, and it stays around 125 watts in games. Like, this is not 115 watts. I think what went wrong here was partially the fault of Asus for not really marketing it right, but also on reviewers for not doing their research. Basically, all you do is switch the laptop from turbo to manual mode, and you get a free extra 10 watts of juice to the GPU. You don't need to even increase your fan speeds. In fact, you can even lower your fan speeds if you want. I mean, shoot, in Jailbreak you can do it without having to do any of that. Just drag this slider right here and boom, 125 watts. So that puts this on the same level as last year's G14 for GPU power, which makes sense because the G14 is really compact, and even though this one is 16-inch, it's extremely thin and light. But does that translate in games though? Well, we'll see. If you get the 4060 or 4070 model of this laptop, then none of that even matters because those chips don't really scale well above 100 watts, and performance kind of tops out around there anyways. So for the folks with those GPUs, you can probably just run the laptop in balance mode and get roughly the same performance as you would in turbo, which I'll give you an idea of shortly. Also about this GPU, this is the second year that you're seeing these GPUs from Nvidia, so that's really a bummer already. We usually at least get like a TI or a Super in between major chip years, but not this time. This already puts all 2024 laptops at a disadvantage now because none of them can really show any gains in this department. However, it's always fascinating for me to see how much GPU wattage affects performance and CPU efficiency and all that. So you'll see in our TimeSpy graphics score here, the G16 comes out around 18,000 graphics score on the 4090 model, roughly the same as the G14 at the same wattage, so as expected. The 4080 model should be around 16,000 to 17,000, and the 4070 model should be around 12,000. Just kind of like where the Flow X16 is right here. You can see those laptops at the top also have a 4090, but with a bit more juice going to them at around 175 watts, and people love to use wattage as a way of writing off laptops like this. I think that's a bucket of baloney. It's way more about the full picture and what else the laptop brings to the table. And sometimes the difference in FPS is so small that if you didn't have an FPS counter on the screen, you probably wouldn't even know which one was which. And you might even think one looks smoother than the other just because the display is better or something like that. But anyways, I'm also kind of a lunatic and I love to push these GPUs to their absolute maximum. And that's why I like to use a little trick called Vbios swapping to make the G16 here think that it has 175 watts instead of 125. The funny thing is there's actually a pretty game-changing feature this year that only Asus laptops have that make Vbios swapping not only safer, but actually have fun tweaking with. And that's this one little slider right here, the base TGP slider. I talked about that in the software section, but basically you can control exactly how much wattage to pump to your GPU with just this one slider. And that works with a Vbios swap as well. Asus basically made a way for us to adjust our Nvidia's Vbios on the fly. And this is essentially the same as the TGP power slider in MSI Afterburner that Nvidia Nvidia greedily leaves locked out on laptops, but they accidentally unlocked it on just a couple Nvidia drivers from last year. So, but yeah, why is any of this important? So that means I can run something as hot and dangerous as 175 watt Vbios from the G16, for example, but I can choose to run it at, say, 148 watts if I want, or switch over to a whole new power profile that I created that pushes it all the way to 175, or I can just run it at the stock 125 watts without actually having to swap my Vbios again. So this results in me scoring over 21,000 graphics score in Time Spy, putting it right up there with the other ThiccBoy 4090s, and setting a world record for this laptop that, since making this, has been beat because I told everyone how to do it. But hey, I didn't push it super far in games, mostly had it around 150 watts just for concerns over thermals. Definitely could be pushed and tweaked further. So for example, you can edit the ghelper config file to make the base TGP 175 watts instead of 150, but your mileage may vary if it actually hits that full wattage all the time. And of course, something like a laptop cooling stand would help too. I actually found that the G16 handles this extra GPU wattage better than last year's G14 did without spiking temperatures too much. I could really get like a sweet spot of around 130 watts plus 20 watts dynamic boost, but I would encourage others to try 150 watts with no dynamic boost, or maybe 150 watts base with 15 watts dynamic boost. You can really go wild with this. But there are only two problems with this. First of all, you have to use a 2024 Asus ROG laptop's Vbios in order for that slider to work. Otherwise, it's going to be pinned at 175 watts and the laptop will crash unless you do some tweaks to the GPU clock limit using ghelper or something. I reached out to like 20 people with the 2024 G16 to get that Vbios, which I'll link in the description for both the 4080 and 4090 in case any of you are crazy enough to try this. I'm also going to give a shout out to those people for helping me out. Here they all are. Keep in mind again, if you're on a 4060 or 4070, there's really no benefit in doing this since they don't scale much beyond 100 watts anyway. The second problem with this, and this is not preventable unfortunately, is that you will lose your right side USB-C display port out, which means no direct Nvidia connection, and your HDMI output will also be limited to 1080p 60 Hz. The left side USB-C display out will work fine though, but that one's connected to Optimus, so no Gsync and potentially slightly lower performance, but I've tried both the G16 and 18 and both have the same behavior. I mean, you could theoretically take a chance on another laptop's Vbios like the Legion or the Blade or MSI, but your mileage might vary and you could end up breaking your laptop by trying those. So there's always a risk in Vbios flashing, so proceed with caution. I definitely don't recommend that to everyone. And I don't take responsibility. Do not blame me if something goes wrong. But I do have a video on my channel for Vbios swapping if you're interested, and I'll be updating for 2024 very soon. If someone was actually crazy enough to try one of those other ones, let me know in a comment. I've also seen some weird claims from other reviews with this laptop and can confidently say those issues are not happening for anyone. This one from Hardware Canucks is the main one I'd like to address. They claim that the G16 gets wildly inconsistent gaming benchmark results because of what they presume to be a power struggle between Armoury Crate and Windows and or the Intel Core Ultra chips. And this is simply not the case with these laptops. Like, I love their channel and I watch all of their reviews, so I'm not trying to bash them. All I'm saying is that before making potentially damaging claims, I would make sure to always verify something like this with actual users of the laptop. And don't get me wrong, these guys are great and I highly recommend checking out their channel. This is all intended as constructive criticism. Again, not trying to bash. I'm just trying to make the point that reviewers could easily verify findings like this with other owners and avoid accidentally spreading damaging misinformation about an otherwise great laptop. You know, like go on Reddit and message people with the laptop. I sort of understand if it's a pre-release review and you can't talk about it, but this laptop has been out for over 2 months now. Lots of people have it, and most people are more than happy to run a benchmark for you to help figure something out. Now, I know they review so many things and maybe it slipped their mind, but I'm just saying. And they said they confirmed it with Asus, but if Asus confirmed the issue, then why can't users? Why can nobody else? Nobody's actually having this issue. So something just isn't adding up here. And this probably happens all the time and we don't even realize. Like, I only made such a stand about it because I'm reviewing the same laptop, and with any review I constantly poll other people just to make sure my results are in line, and sure enough, no one else I talked to had this issue. As an extra measure, I even asked other G16 owners with a variety of configurations to run the same benchmarks they did and screenshot their results. And I got a lot of data back from a lot of people, and what do you know, just like my unit, we all had consistent results through each run and never experienced any weird weird fluctuations like hardware Canucks did. So that doesn't make their entire review bad or invalid, but it does highlight a potentially deeper issue. My best guess, honestly, as to what actually happened is that maybe they were given early review units, or maybe they're just running a completely different build of drivers or BIOS versions than what consumers actually got. Anyways, no hate to them. I just really needed to debunk that because it just caught me off guard so bad. Plus, I know if I didn't say anything about it, I was probably going to get a bunch of comments like, well, what about the inconsistencies and benchmarks? Like, yeah. So there you have it. If you're considering buying this, you don't have to worry about that. Another claim I saw in a review out there was that disabling E-cores would increase performance in some games. I tried to reproduce this, and so did some others I asked, and we just got about the same results as we did with them enabled. So I'm not sure what's up with that one either, other than I think I've heard about cases where older games benefit from no E-cores for compatibility reasons. Alright, so speaking of confirming quirks with the community before making claims, I did run into one myself that I had others test as well, and can confirm these results are actually fairly consistent with other users here. This one is not necessarily a quirk of the G16, but kind of more about the Intel Core Ultra CPU. So if you know what a mux switch is, you know that generally disabling the integrated graphics typically increases performance, maybe not so much in 2024, but usually at least a little bit, and usually more so in CPU-bound games like Counter-Strike. What I found was that sometimes with the G16, the opposite was actually the case. I could pretty much replicate this in TimeSpy every single time, where my CPU score would be in the 11,000s with the Intel graphics completely disabled, so DGPU mode. But if instead I was in Optimus or hybrid mode, the CPU score would go up to over 12,000 every time. Not everyone I talked to had this same problem exactly, but the majority did notice the same thing, and I received benchmarks from people to show that they did in fact have the exact same quirk. And even in games, I noticed that. Most of the time, there was almost no difference in benchmark results between Optimus and DGPU mode, but then, I would push some games to be more CPU bound here. So for example, on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I actually got one more FPS from 156 to 157 in Optimus mode, which just never happens. So it's just so weird to see. Even at QHD, my Optimus results were only 1 FPS behind. And again, in some games, especially at 1080p, it would kind of surpass my DGPU mode results. So it's just a weird quirk. I'm pretty sure it's the Intel Meteor Lake CPU. Maybe it's a Windows optimization that needs to happen for this chip, or maybe it's an Asus optimization that needs to happen for this chip. I'm not 100% sure, but it is still very new. So, we'll probably see chipset driver updates down the line that might increase this performance over time. Because technically the CPU really should be hitting closer to 14,000 or even higher in TimeSpy, just going off of what other Intel CPUs score in this benchmark. But it's not a major difference. One thing I did figure out that helped was disabling core isolation and Windows security. This at least boosted my score to 12,000 without being an Optimus. So it still doesn't explain why Optimus is performing so highly. So if anyone figures that out, please let me know. But I guess at least it's good to know that your FPS will likely be the same whether you activate your mux switch or not. So creators are gonna love this laptop. This is, funny enough, it actually comes with Nvidia Studio drivers pre-installed, so that doesn't really mean anything, it's not made for gaming or anything. It's just, those drivers are basically just older, more optimized drivers that are more stable for creative applications. So it doesn't really mean it's not a gaming machine or anything. It's just that I think it's just kind of telling as to who Asus is marketing this to, and that seems to be creators. So this thing just does really good in every creative application. Photoshop here, it's kind of in the middle of the road. All these laptops here are all getting excellent performance, so it's really not even that far from the top, all things considered. Over 7,000 points in the Puget benchmark, which is really good. The crazy thing here is you drop into balance mode and the score doesn't even change. It's still right over 7,000. And then again in silent mode, we're almost at 6,000. It leads the charts here. And you'll kind of see that across the board, really. Balance mode and silent mode just does really good here. And I think that's really important to highlight because I know a lot of creatives are not using their laptops in their highest performance mode. You're not over here in a coffee shop editing at freaking full blast fans turbo mode. So I'm going to be cycling through these charts quick, but that's why I'm including those in there. So just be aware of the chart, whether it's balanced or silent mode, because those have a really big impact. Some laptops, lead the charts in their max performance profile, but that doesn't always tell the full story. And it's the same with battery. You have some here like Photoshop and Premiere Pro on battery where it's pretty much at the top or close to the top of the results compared to other laptops, even ones that are more thick and powerful than this one. Plus, those thicker and powerful laptops are going to be eating through their battery while they're trying to do this. So I know some people do work on battery, so just something to keep in mind. And then for my audio people out there, I run an Ableton benchmark. This kind of just shows how well the laptop handles audio, VST plugins, things like that. Hitting about 24% CPU load in the demo session on Ableton, and that's a ton of tracks and a ton of plugins all going at once. So that's a great result. Intel usually seems to come out ahead here over AMD. So, compared to the G14, for example, and lower is better. So with it only being in the 20s on this session, that's great to see. So let's talk thermals and wattage here. So I'm going to use control here because this game really likes to push GPU or CPU depending on the settings. So when you're in turbo or manual mode, this is when your GPU is getting pushed to its limits. For example, here I'm in manual mode, which gives you the full 125 watts to the GPU. And you're looking at about 73 degrees on the GPU. CPU here, with it being this GPU bound, is only running at like 14 watts and only hitting like 78. So we're in the 70s on both CPU and GPU in this mode. Of course, the fans are louder here, but I mean, that's great temperatures. If instead we make this CPU bound running at 1080p, DLSS, low settings, you'll see our CPU climb up to 45 watts, and the temps of course are going to hit in the 80s now, while the GPU will run about 95 to 100 watts at a temperature of like the low 70s, 72, 73. So still great results here. Yes, the CPU will hit in the 90s occasionally, especially with little spikes here and there when it hits like 50 watts or so, but that's normal. I mean, we see that in pretty much every gaming laptop. So now we're switching from manual to turbo, which will decrease the wattage a little bit. So GPU bound turbo mode, you can see it's just hitting 10 watts less on the GPU than it was before in manual mode. You can apply those extra 10 watts to turbo mode or any other mode if you want using G-Helper, but this is just the stock ones right here, 115 watts, running about mid 70s on the GPU, about 15 watts on the CPU, running at around 80. So really not bad temperatures at all for a laptop this thin. After long sessions, you might see that GPU head up to like upper 70s, maybe 80 or so, but still really not bad overall. So CPU bound on this one, it's going to be running like 35 to 40 watts, while the GPU is hitting like, anywhere between like 70 to 95 watts, mostly staying around 90 to 95. Temperatures in the mid 70s on the GPU, mid to high 80s on the CPU. So now in performance mode, or balance mode as I like to call it, 85 to 90 watts on the GPU, running at, again, low to mid 70s. And CPU wattage actually, for some reason, even though this is GPU bound, is like 4 or 5 watts higher than turbo mode at like 18 watts, running at around 80 degrees. So again, seriously, really good results. And this is a very high performing balance mode compared to a lot of other gaming laptops out there. And especially compared to other Ultrabooks. Like, this is a balance mode that is still higher than most Ultrabooks can even achieve in their highest fans blasting max performance mode. So CPU bound, if you're in performance or balance mode, pushes the CPU to 30 watts, about high 70s, low to mid 80s in temperatures. And then the GPU will run at about 70 to 85 watts, hitting low 70s the whole time. So those are great numbers for being CPU bound. So the default Asus silent mode is kind of poorly tuned in GPU bound scenarios, usually a little under 55 watts on the GPU, which completely destroys the 4080 and 4090. Like, these GPUs cannot run that low without everything just becoming a slideshow. And you can see that here, even the FPS is dropping to like 20 FPS when we were getting over 100 earlier. Temperature wise though, it's looking good. About 15, 16 watts on the CPU, hitting 80 or a little under that, and then only 70 on the GPU. But again, I definitely don't recommend using the default Armory Crate silent mode. Highly recommend using G-Helper silent mode. It just fixes it. Like, I don't even consider this the default silent mode because of how much better G-Helpers is. The funny thing about Armory Crate's stock silent mode is it really wants you to be CPU bound. It really pushes the CPU. So if you do want to just game on Armory Crate silent mode, I just recommend trying to get yourself as CPU bound as possible. Look how much of a difference it makes when we're playing at 1080p here. The CPU is hitting 19 to 20 watts, only hitting like high 70s, low 80s in temperatures. GPU is using that 54 or 55 watts. And before, that was causing this to be a stuttery mess, but those extra just few watts on the CPU is like saving this game. And I found that to be the case in many games as well. So if you are going to use the default silent mode, just try to get yourself CPU bound. Lower settings, lower your resolution, and that should help. So if you get this laptop, this is my recommended settings, and this kind of goes for any configuration, not just the 4090. So if you want to game in silent mode, this is what I recommend. Go to the default silent mode, make a new power profile based off of it, name it something, you know, like actually good silent mode. Raise the fans just a little bit, and this might take some trial and error, but I found, you know, usually just raising them a good few hundred RPM on CPU and GPU usually does the trick. You can set a GPU clock limit if you want, although it's not necessary really. And then I usually set the GPU power either all the way down, but if it gets a little stuttery, I'll just turn it up just a few watts. You can play around with it, but I have it set to 85 watts plus 5 watts dynamic boost on the GPU. Temperature target 87 because I'm not too scared. If it gets a little close to the thermal limit, that's totally fine by me because I know that it's going to throttle if it has to. I leave the CPU just default. I don't even check that box at all because I want the CPU to just dynamically adjust itself as needed. Oh, and definitely make sure you stop Asus services because that can get in the way and it might completely screw up your power profile. So just with those settings, let's see what we're getting. So we're getting like 15-ish watts on the CPU, 85 to 90 watts on the GPU. We're getting great temperatures. It's looking good. We're hitting like 200 FPS in Apex right now. CPU's using like 20 to 30 watts and temperatures are looking fine. And this is super low fan noise, like super low fans. You simply cannot do this on any other gaming laptop. Maybe the Blade 16 is the closest, but that one you can't adjust. You're just stuck with what they give you. Whereas here, you know, if you want to crank the fans just a little higher, you can, or if you want to decrease the fan noise and decrease performance a little bit more, you can. That's the great thing with G Helper. If you want a good balance mode, start with the stock balance mode, make a new profile based off of it. I usually leave the CPU power limits stock to let them adjust dynamically, but I am going to adjust the fan curve and I'm going to bring up everything just a few hundred RPM, which a lot of the time it's a barely noticeable difference. And of course, I'll move some of the points a little further left so that's not pulsing so much. But you can play with this as needed. You know, you don't always have to have fans come on at 50 degrees or whatever. So just adjust that to your liking. I will do a small overclock and a limit of 2000 megahertz. That's just me. You don't even have to do that. GPU power, I'm going to give it 90 watts plus 15 watts dynamic boost if the CPU isn't working. 87 degree thermal target, although it's probably not going to hit that. And let's see what we get. So this gets us hitting about 90 to 105 watts on the GPU. The temperatures are just fine. They're chilling. In fact, after a few minutes, yeah, that'll go up to maybe like mid 70s, maybe 80 on the GPU. Same with the CPU is probably going to hit mid 80s, but still, this is great. We're getting like 200 to 220 FPS just off of this. And again, these fans are not much higher than the silent mode ones were. So you can definitely play with that and get them even higher if you want. If you want a really good turbo mode, all you really have to do is just slide the GPU power slider all the way to the right. That's it. I really don't do anything else with this one. I don't even mess with the fans or the CPU. Just sliding that GPU to the right is all you really need to hit the 125 watts. You can increase the fans a little more if you wanted, but I usually just leave that alone and I usually leave the CPU alone. I find that the CPU will adjust itself as needed. And the only time I would maybe adjust that is if you're trying to lower CPU limits. Say your CPU is just taking too much of your dynamic boost away and you don't want it to be CPU bound. Maybe try lowering your CPU to like 15 to 20 watts and just see what happens. Those are my recommended settings for the G16. You could probably get away with even less on the 4060 or 4070 model. So just play with it as needed, but all right, so gaming benchmark. So this thing comes out to be pretty good for a gaming machine, especially for how thin and light this thing is. Like, I cannot stress enough how thin this machine is. It's important to keep that in mind when you're looking at these numbers. Obviously, it's not going to be hitting the same as a laptop that's twice as thick and almost twice the weight. So just keep that in mind. What we do want to look at, though, is in comparison to the G14, which has the same amount of GPU wattage at 125 watts. So let's see where those fall on the charts. Also, I tend to lose a lot of people in this section. So for some of these, I'm just going to breeze through and you can pause the video if there's a chart you want to look at. Although I'm gonna go a little in detail just on Cyberpunk, only because I have a disclaimer here. This game, since the recent updates, has resulted in a bit lower FPS across the board for every laptop I've tested. So I'm not sure how well that reflects in game, but at least in the benchmark, I've been getting some scores that were like 10 FPS less than they were before. For example, on this Ultra preset here, for some of these, you'll see the G14 in here twice, just because I'm trying to show you how much less FPS we were getting now compared to then. So all the numbers in red here, you can basically subtract like 5 to 10 FPS off of those because that's what they probably would be now if I still had those laptops. So just keep that in mind as I'm cycling through these. I didn't want to take them out completely because this is still good data, but just take it with a grain of salt that the gap isn't as wide as it might seem on some of these benchmarks. So yeah, I found that the performance gap between this laptop and much larger and thicker laptops wasn't as far apart as some reviewers make it seem. The majority of the wider gaps seem to be influenced by the CPU difference, and I think that's really the only reason this would occasionally definitely fall behind last year's G14 as well. And keep in mind, if you're getting the 4060 or 4070 model, then I mean, you'll be right up there with the competition, since anything over 100 watts scores about the same for those GPUs. So even a thicker, heavier laptop like the Legion Pro 5 will score about the same as this in games, aside from maybe the CPU. So if you are getting like the 4070 model, just look at the Flow X16 right here in my charts, because that's going to be about where it falls. But again, where this laptop excels, just like the G14, is that balanced and silent mode. You can see here on some of these charts when I'm dropping into balance mode, a lot of the times it could go from near the bottom to near the top of the chart, even surpassing some of the thicker laptops. So that is really cool to see. And then in silent mode, it's almost no competition. It really just excels every single time. That's one thing I just like to do, because not many reviews really show balanced and silent mode, and I think it paints a much better picture of what the actual laptop is capable of in a variety of configurations, because I know a lot of people are not always gaming at full turbo fans, especially if you're bringing this around people. So again, it's just really cool to see those silent mode results. As for some of those differences with the G14 coming out ahead, even though they have the same GPU wattage and it's not running hot or anything, my best guess is just there's not quite that single core performance that a lot of games love to use on the G16. Meteor Lake is still very new. I think maybe like in the next generation of it, they'll likely find a way to increase that aspect of the CPU. So at the end of the day though, it's still a 4000 series laptop, just like the 4000 series laptops from last year. So we're just not going to see improvements from any laptop on the gaming side of things until 2025. All right, so final thoughts. So when you think about the dimensions of this laptop, how insanely thin it is, almost as thin as a 15-inch MacBook Air, then it's almost more appropriate and fair to think about it in terms of comparisons to Ultrabooks. Think of it like a Dell XPS or like a better Samsung Galaxy Book, but with a 125 watt GPU instead of like a 60 watt or whatever they have, especially considering some of those XPS laptops also have a vapor chamber too. So for this laptop to achieve all of that without running like a freaking volcano is insane. I've seen people call this an inferior laptop compared to like a Legion Pro 7i, and that just doesn't make sense here. Like, these are quite literally two different classes of machine at this point. To me, the fact that the G16 even gets close at 125 watts on the GPU was just insanely impressive. It feels like it shouldn't be that powerful. Like, it's too good to be true sometimes. So while it isn't going to get you the highest possible FPS in games of any laptop out there, and it's not, of course, going to be the value king as far as FPS, a lot of people consider FPS and value to equal the same thing, and that's just a weird way of thinking about it, because I know it's a gaming laptop, but there's a way more to a gaming laptop than just the FPS you get in games. Like, price per frame doesn't really apply here with a laptop like this, because it makes up for that with all the other aspects. And again, keep in mind that the 4060 and 4070 model will be right up there with the rest of them. So when we're talking about the complete package, the other parts that make this laptop special, we have this OLED display, a first of its kind with Gsync and Advanced Optimus on a laptop, the speakers, which again are the best I've heard from any laptop, and the chassis as a whole is a huge step in the right direction. Just one of the nicest gaming laptop chassis out there, if not the best I've used. Like, they have now reached Razer levels of look and feel, and I think a lot of people would actually prefer this, especially considering the price difference. And let's talk about price for a second. In the US, you can find the 4070 model for $19.99, the 4080 for $26.99, and the 4090 for $32.99. All things considered, this pricing is pretty in line with the competition, if not cheaper than many of the other ones out there. The good thing too is at Best Buy, they usually have sales like up to $300 off pretty often, plus open box, like you can save a significant amount. I've already seen the 4070 model go on sale, and the 4080 and 4090 ones will of course go on sale several times throughout the year. So yeah, I feel like it's pretty fair compared to the competition, especially considering what you get for the display and other components. Compared to other gaming laptops, the equivalent Razer Blade 16 OLED is $4,200, so basically $1,000 more. And I'm sorry, but to me that only makes the G16 more enticing. And it is great to see Razer finally get some competition on that front for premium built laptops. I only hope this drives them to maybe reconsider their pricing a bit in 2025, because things have just gotten out of hand. The Blade is of course thicker and heavier, offering more performance while taking a big hit to battery life and efficiency at lower wattages. The only other gaming laptop with the same CPU and GPU combo really is the Alienware X16 R2. And while that one definitely wins in the GPU department, it loses out with a sort of dim 300 nit IPS display. It's heavier. The Alienware software is pretty whack. And despite it being pretty thin still, it's actually quite a bit bigger in length and width. I got this picture from a user on Reddit who had both, and just wow, it almost looks like an 18-inch laptop next to the G16. So that's comparing it to some other gaming laptops. Now let's look at some of the Ultrabook competition. Because again, I think that's where this kind of falls in line as like a gaming Ultrabook. For example, I see a lot of people comparing this to the Lenovo Yoga Pro 9i 4060 and 4070 model. And personally, I think the G16 wins there too, especially for gaming. That's one where actual user experiences don't seem to be quite as impressive as some of the reviews make it seem, at least from the research I did on it and looking at user reviews. For sake of not making this video too long, I'm just going to throw some of the pros and cons I found with the Yoga on the screen here. But keep in mind, these are just things that I found, and I only threw them on here when I saw one or two other people agreeing that the same thing was happening with them, and things that I found on the spec sheets and watching other reviews. To me, that's quite a laundry list. A couple highlights, especially the HDMI port only being 2.0, the fans kicking in at 42 degrees Celsius, the lower battery life. Like, this is a laundry list. I don't think personally I'd be able to deal with those things, knowing that the G16 could do a lot of that much better. I also see a lot of people comparing it to the new Lenovo Legion Slim 7i, or Legion 7i. The Legion 7i before used to be what the Legion Pro 7i is now. So anyways, the Legion Slim 7i is what I'm going to call it, is a little bit thicker than the G16, a little heavier, well, almost a pound heavier actually. Pretty significant. Only goes up to a 4070. It does have a more powerful CPU, but it is going to have much worse battery life because of that. Think about 4 to 5 hours in YouTube playback compared to 9 to 10 on the G16. So pretty much half the battery life. Depending on the display option you get, looks like a lot of them are 100% sRGB. So that's a pretty low color gamut in comparison. So colors are going to look a little more dull. The speakers are of course worse. The CPU seems to run pretty hot, but I think that's just because it's a 14900HX and such a small chassis. I don't think that'll actually be an issue for people. And then the fan noise seems to be about the same, maybe a little higher on the Legion, hitting about 50 decibels or more. Otherwise, both seem to be still really good options. They both seem to be very quiet in their silent mode. The white chassis looks pretty good. And it's nice to have an unlocked CPU. I just wouldn't consider this quite as premium as the G16. You know, it doesn't have the unibody aluminum, the amazing speakers, the OLED. So it's just not a bad option. I just think the G16 is like a step up personally, especially with them being about the same price. So to sum things up, I think the G16 is really for people who want something better than an Ultrabook, but who also don't want the traditional thick, heavy gaming laptop. It is quite literally like an Ultrabook on steroids, with premium features that are much more premium than other gaming laptops, and gaming features that are much, much better than those found on other Ultrabooks. I think that's a balance that's basically impossible to find in the current market, and to this day, there are only 2 laptops that can give you both a top spec GPU and great battery life. Just this one and last year's G14. Plus, that extra portability is just so nice for traveling, whether that be school or just a different room of your house. The G16, in my opinion, is pure luxury. Like, it is one of the best and most revolutionary laptops to enter the gaming space in a long time, and I will welcome that with open arms. So if you want that MacBook-like feel, get the G16. But if you want that same performance but in a somewhat thicker but lighter laptop that isn't quite as premium and has a smaller screen, I still say go with the 2023 G14. Or if you want that smaller screen and a MacBook-like feel, and you don't care about a 4080 or 4090 spec, then the 2024 G14 is a great option. A review on that one is on the way, so make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell so you don't miss it. And I'll see you in that one soon. For now, be sure to check out my other reviews like last year's G14 and my Blade 16 review, which gives insight on both last year's and this year's model. Anyways, thanks again for watching. See you next time.